Thank you for having me. This really came about in part. Sasha had a field trip to Boston over the summer and visited the city and was very impressed with some of the things we were doing. I was actually on vacation. And one of my coworkers, I guess, sang my praises enough that she was willing to take a chance on bringing me out here, and also the patience to deal with another very busy, stressed out practitioner in terms of getting a paper to the website. My presentation, I say building income restricted housing. I say that term very intentionally. You've heard a little bit of it already about the difficulties of using the term affordable. Who is it affordable to whom? And so we are very much in our city saying the term income restricted to make it clear that this is any type of housing that has some kind of restriction on it, whether it's publicly owned, nonprofit owned, privately owned with some kind of deed restriction. Give you a quick overview on Boston. Boston had a population of about 800,000 in 1950, but by 1980 it had fallen to 542,000. We slowly grew from 1980 to 2010, adding about 70,000 people. But over the last 7 years, we have added another 70,000 people. The city is now growing faster than any time in the city's history since the 19-teens, which is when much of the city was actually built. The city, though, is still only around 700,000 people, but it is the center of an 8.2 million person region. So you could say that we're a very small part of our metropolitan area, unlike some of like Toronto and other cities are very much part of their metro. So we're just behind the San Francisco Bay Area in terms of population. Nearly 20% of Boston's housing stock is income restricted. Boston has 10% of the Massachusetts housing units, but 20% of the income restricted units for the entire state. And Greater Boston has a higher percentage of income restricted housing than any other major US metro. This doesn't change the fact that we have incredible stresses on our market right now. We have, with this growth, it's been over the last 3 years that this has been building up steam. But for example, the median condo price of the city is now over $650,000 with US, so 850 Canadian. But there are some neighborhoods where you can buy a condo for $250,000, but also some neighborhoods where the median price is $1.3 million. So it's a very diverse city in that way. So what we did in 2014 under the new mayor, Mayor Walsh, was create a housing plan for the first time for the city. We said that we were going to build 53,000 new units of housing by 2030, which is our 400th anniversary, of which 12,000 would be income restricted. And after the recent gains in population and changes in this year in our update, we changed it to 69,000 units total, of which 16,000 would be income restricted. So I was asked to really talk about two different topics today, so I'm going to kind of run through both of them. One is what I work with on a day-to-day basis, which is our inclusionary development policy, but also to talk about community development corporations. So Boston's housing landscape has a number of private actors, for-profit developers, community development corporations, which I'll call CDCs, advocates, lenders, tenant organizers, funders, service providers, all those things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the for-profit developers and the community development corporations today. Now for the city of Boston, we have a number of different agencies. In fact, too many agencies that work on housing. We have the property owner, the Boston Housing Authority, which owns about 9% of the city's housing stock in public housing, which was mostly built from the 1930s to through the 1960s, although we're in the process of rebuilding much of that stock. Production, which is the Department of Neighborhood Development, which has the federal and state resources that go into affordable housing creation, mostly done by nonprofits, and where projects are fully affordable. And then my agency, Boston Planning and Development Agency. We were started in the 1950s as the city's redevelopment authority, so the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and we've grown into this agency. We are not funded by the city directly. We get our funds from the land we own. We own primarily, we have an old Army base and an old Navy base on the waterfront that were decommissioned, and we own that land there, and we have ground leases. And for example, the world headquarters for Reebok is on our land. So in terms of which income groups different agencies work with, the Boston Housing Authority, both in public housing and through vouchers, work primarily with households under 50,000. The Department of Redevelopment works with homeless set-asides in new units, affordable housing production. We work primarily with more middle-income households through the Inclusionary Development Policy, rental and homeownership programs, so it's IDP for short. And the City of Boston also helps middle-income households buy their first home with down payment assistance. I've already kind of talked about the BHA. They have 12,418 units and 70 developments, and they also have 16,000 mobile vouchers. There's also a state voucher program that they work with. I'm kind of moving through this. So now we can talk about the Inclusionary Development Policy. It was first created by then Mayor Menino in 2000 as a pilot. Now, I call it a policy because this is not inclusionary zoning. This is a policy. The state has allowed cities and towns in Massachusetts to do inclusionary zoning, but as with all things, they let the rest of the towns and cities do something, but they don't let Boston do something, unless we specifically ask for it. So we have not specifically asked for it, although we're preparing to do so in this next calendar year. So it's been a policy for these last 18 years. Mayor Marty Walsh was elected in 2013, took office in 2014, and revised the policy in December 2015, and my arrival was really as much about revising that policy. It applies to any proposed residential project that has 10 or more units and requires zoning relief, or is financed by the city, or is built on property owned by the city. Now you might think that that might not be everything that's covered by this policy. Well, Boston zoning code is kind of a remnant of 1950s and 60s thoughts of what a suburban low-density city should be. And so 95% of all projects with 10 or more units require a zoning variance. And those that don't require are usually pretty small. So we get units through three ways. On-site units, which are citywide policy, is 13% of the units on-site scattered throughout the project. You see, this is kind of my oh, look, there's one here, one there. The top floor, like someone else in another city, we don't take the top floor. Off-site, depending upon the zone or the neighborhood they're in, they have to do 15 or 18% of the units in a nearby location, which is meant to be a half mile, but in implementation is more like 3/4 mile. Or they contribute to the IDP fund, which is also based on 15 to 18% of the units. So, and that's both for rental or for condo. So for the payment, for the contribution, we have a flat rate depending on which part of the city they're in. We have three zones, basically the downtown neighborhoods, the mid-tier neighborhoods, and the outer neighborhoods. In the outer neighborhoods, there's a minimum payment of $200,000 per unit. In the mid-tier, it's $300,000 per unit, and the downtown, it's $380,000 a unit. Now, I call that the minimum payment. For a rental project, that is the payment. But if it's a condominium, we also have this condo formula that's been around about 10 years. It says that we take the difference between what they would get for the unit as a market rate unit, minus what we would get selling it to an affordable buyer, and divide it by 2. Now, when condos were $600,000, that was fine. It was the minimum payment. But now we have downtown projects. Their units are going for $2, $3, $4 million. And what they would owe us is $900,000 to $1 million per unit that they're buying now. So what that means is that developers really don't want to pay that. They can't pay that. They can't afford to keep the unit on-site. So they're actively looking for off-site locations. So I almost have this whole world of doing off-sites, which is my daily nightmares. So over the length of the policy, we've done 2,072 on-site and off-site units. It sounds like a lot in some ways. It's still only, in terms of our total housing stock, it's still less than 1% of our housing stock. 325 completed just in 2017. So that was, however, about a third of the new income restricted units that came online. So the other 2/3 were funded through traditional sources, but that's a pretty substantial portion of the new units coming online. Overall, about 28% are ownership units, all of them condos, although we're about to get our first IDP houses, including one that's three bedroom, fully ADA accessible, because it's a whole little cul-de-sac neighborhood on the edge of the city, and 72% are rental funds. IDP units are targeted moderate to middle income households making $50,000 to $100,000. Rental units are made available to households with incomes up to about $68,000 if they're a household of 3, and home ownership up to about $97,000 if they're a household of 3. Of course, some of the issues around the inclusionary development policies, you get the units where the development is happening. Now, in some ways, that's good, because you're getting units in neighborhoods where we can't afford to buy the land for affordable housing. It also means that you're not necessarily getting in all the neighborhoods. So this is a location of where the units are completed. The red and the blue are completed, and the yellow were in construction or permitted over the last year. You'll see one very big one up in a downtown area right here. That's the Beverly, which was completed earlier this year, which I know that the team went to go see, which is a 229-unit building built on public land, but it also has what we call tax credit units, which are regular affordable units. It has one tranche of off-site IDP units, plus voluntarily restricted units of a higher income by the developer. So the contributions to the IDP fund, $123.5 million have been received through 2017. $16 million were received just in 2017. It has completed 1,140 units across the city. You can see the yellow dots were the contributors. The red dots are where those buildings are actually built, and those do represent a number of places across the city. So turning to income restricted housing built by nonprofits. Now this is all done through the Department of Neighborhood Development, our sister agency, and we're using the same kind of sources that other cities are using in the US, community development block grants, home funds, low-income housing tax credits, state sources. There's an affordable housing trust, housing innovations fund, we have a state low-income housing tax credit source. And then the city local sources, we have inclusionary development funds, linkage funds, community preservation act funds, operating funds occasionally, bond financing, very little. We kind of like Toronto are not really using our capital funds for housing. We do have occasional one-offs, as I'll call them, where we may be selling a building or some land where we're selling it for a high dollar and then we turn that money into housing. Linkage Funds is one of these. It was created in 1987. This is where we actually get impact fees from commercial developments. It requires large commercial mixed-use projects to fund workforce development and income-restricted housing programs. They're managed by the Neighborhood Housing Trust, which has like a city councilor, a rep from several people, 5 people usually, but it's staffed by the Department of Neighborhood Development. And then we also get workforce development funds also, which not many cities do. They're managed by the Neighborhood Jobs Trust. Then we also have Community Preservation Act funds. State legislation created that in 2000. We actually had a ballot question in 2001 to approve it. It was defeated. So, and you have to do a ballot question in your local city or town to get it passed. So there was a lot of like, let's not do this. Because it is a surcharge on your property taxes. We actually did come back in 2016, and it passed easily. Because I think that says something about the change in the tenor of the city and the desires. It must be used for open space, historic preservation, and affordable housing. So there's a minimum % for each type, and then you're free to use the rest of the money for any one of those 3 types. So the CPA has its pluses and minuses. In some more rural communities, they've actually used this to land bank, open space and not build housing. So it's kind of a problem in terms of how it may work in some cities. The state partially matches it. When it was first created, they matched it entirely, but as their land registry fees have declined, or the more cities are participating, they've actually lowered the match. We expect about 20 million in income from that each year. So this is happening at the same time the federal government is abandoning housing. So before the inclusionary development policy, 78% of the housing that we use to fund affordable housing projects were from the federal government. From 2011 to 2016, that was down to 22% of what we spent. Now, we actually didn't see a reduction in CDBG in-home. It stayed even, which over time means with inflation it's worth less, but also means that for us to do more, we really have to bring more to the table. So the IDP is 30%, the Neighborhood Housing Trust is 25%, and other funds were 23%. You can see that we're becoming increasingly dependent on private development to fund new affordable housing development. So when times are good, they're great, but when they're not, there's a real slowdown. So in this, we put the community development corporations. Development corporations are neighborhood-based agencies, nonprofits with their own board, community focused. They usually have tenants on their boards as well. You could say it was kickstarted in 1966 by the Special Impact Program of the Economic Opportunity Act. Many cities, CDCs were created organically in response to local conditions. I worked at this nonprofit called the Fenway CDC, which is a downtown neighborhood, very student-dominated near Fenway Park. And it was actually created in the 1970s as a response to an arson for profit scheme, where people are literally burning down their buildings for insurance. And these were 19 teens and 20s, 5-story masonry, great buildings. And so that's when that agency was started. So then there's national intermediaries that support the expansion of CDCs, Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation, now known as NeighborWorks, Local Initiative Support Corporation, commonly known as LISC, and the Enterprise Community Partners. So there's 20 CDCs across Boston. Over the last 4 years, they've built 602 units of new income-restricted housing and preserved 612 units of existing income-restricted housing. They work to extend beyond building and managing income-restricted housing, workforce development, asset building, child care, leadership development. But I want to talk about a few of the challenges that they face. One is while they are community-based, they are seen in many of their neighborhoods as developers. So they don't have quite the power that they used to have. They've kind of matured into being these neighborhood-based developers rather than being seen as real community organizations. So you have new community organizations who want to create land trusts. They're saying, I don't trust the CDC. And it's kind of like, well, the CDC is a nonprofit holder of land, and they're going to hold it in perpetuity for affordability, just as a land trust might. So there's this kind of conflict there. Many of them are small. We have some that are kind of they're just barely breathing. We have some that have a nice little group of buildings that they own and they maintain them, but they're not doing a lot of new work. And some that are actually being quite adventurous and entrepreneurial. So there's kind of the gamut of them. But for almost all of them, there's a problem with staffing, they don't pay as well. So keeping the kind of staff they need to do new projects is always a challenge for them. Let's see. Also, they very much live on their developer fees. So it's very much a challenge for them on their ongoing financial basis. We do, however, have a new community development tax credit on the state level that they can use as a fundraising tool. Here's a couple of recent examples from both the IDP program and from community development corporations. We had 832 total units at the V and the Benjamin and the Seaport District, and 96 are income restricted. Here's at 206 West Broadway. We have off-site units. This is where a downtown developer, is doing units with a CDC. At the location, this little infill site was a dry cleaners that burned down. So there was environmental issues in the ground, and that's 16 units that they're doing there. Parcel 25 in Mission Hill, This is Mission Hill Neighborhood Housing Services. They're doing a 3-phase project on state M.P.A. land, which means the subway system. And this is the first phase. They just completed 40 income-restricted rental units. It's also the new home of Metro Housing Boston, which is one of our leading and most important housing service organizations. They moved their offices from downtown to this very transit location, but not downtown, but also close to their clientele. And they use IDP funds and linkage funds. So for further information, bostonplans.org is where my information is. For inclusionary housing, there's Grounded Solutions, which we talked about yesterday, which you can go to their website, inclusionaryhousing.org. And then there's a wealth of information on CDCs here as well.